Welcome to the Unfading Truth Bible reading plan. Today we're reading Exodus chapter 1. Sometimes God gracefully sends suffering. Wait, what? Well, since we last left off, all of Jacob's family now has joined Joseph in Egypt. We'll start reading here at the beginning of the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields, and in all their harsh labor the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Question and answer number 52 of the Heidelberg Catechism. How does Christ's return to judge the living and the dead, how does that comfort you? The answer is that in all my distress and persecution, I turn my eyes to the heavens and confidently await as judge the very one who has already stood trial in my place before God and has so removed the whole curse from me. All his enemies and mine he will condemn to everlasting punishment. But me and all his chosen ones he will take along with him into the joy and glory of heaven. Well, the book of Exodus starts way more dramatically in the original Hebrew than it does in the English translations. We read the opening sentence as, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt." Then the text goes on to list Jacob's sons, whose names should be somewhat familiar since the tribes of Israel will be named after them. But the Hebrew text begins with a tiny one-letter conjunction. And the closest translation would be the simple word "and." In English, it's awkward to start a sentence, much less an entire book, with the word "and." So the translators skip it. But that humble little letter helps point out that the story of redemption that began when Adam and Eve were evicted from the garden continues. Life has become a literal grind for Jacob's descendants, who live under the thumb of a society completely ignorant of its own history. The new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, viewed these Hebrews as an existential threat. His plan is to work them to death by enslaving them to build a couple of warehouse cities. But the new king can't out-dictate God's blessings, and so the people continue to prosper. So the new king resorts to one of the key indicators of a truly debauched society: abortion. He orders that the baby boys must be killed before they're fully born. But since the midwives get there late, well, they miss the opportunity to kill them before they actually become human beings. Let's dig a little bit deeper. The perennial question arises in these ugly situations: where is God? Where was he as his people's lives were made bitter with harsh labor and were worked ruthlessly? Where was he as the Pharaoh issued a death warrant for baby boys? That's a question we often ask today. Where is God in the midst of a cancer diagnosis or a horrible accident? Of course, the Bible never fully answers that difficult question as to why God allows such evil things to occur. But today's passage gives us just a little smidgen of understanding. Sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, these hardships are actually mysterious outpourings of God's grace. Think of it this way. What if this opening chapter played out completely the opposite? What if instead of bitter, ruthless conditions, the descendants of Jacob had nothing but sunshine and roses? Then slowly but surely, each subsequent generation would become less Hebrew and more Egyptian, until the God of Jacob meant nothing to the people. As such a prosperous people, they'd have no incentive to leave Egypt, and then the conditions for our Savior's birth would have never been met. God's covenant promises would have withered. We've already seen this phenomenon as we've read the Bible this past month. God allows the elements of misery to afflict his people in order to keep us pointed and focused on the glory that will be revealed in us, which far surpasses our present sufferings. You can read about that in Romans 8. God put his mightiest angel between Adam and the tree of life. God confused the language at Babel. God made Noah build a boat in the desert. God made life miserable in Egypt to prod his people back to the promised land. And he did all of these things to keep his people pointed towards the coming Savior. This doesn't mean that every tragedy that you've suffered is somehow God's grace in disguise. But keep in mind, when suffering comes, that our sovereign God and Father uses all things to keep you longing for his coming kingdom. As you pray today, use the AAA prayer pattern. That's where you begin your prayer by acknowledging who God is. Today, open your prayer to our Father, who providentially controls all things for the good of those who have been called according to his purpose. Then as you pray, go on to align your life with God's will. Pray that the suffering you experience will keep you pointed towards our Savior. Then you can ask God for what it is that you need. Remember, everything else that you hear today will fade away, but the word of the Lord is unfading truth.